Welcome to the Authority File, the podcast where you'll hear conversations with academic librarians, technologists, researchers, and authors whose work is laying the foundation for higher education's future. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. If you're new to the Authority File, you can listen to and find previous episodes on all of the major podcast platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, and on our website, choice360.org. My guest is Dr. Bob Brinkman, Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Northern Illinois University. He is also a professor of Earth, Atmosphere, and Environment, and an author, advocate, and researcher on issues of sustainability. He's appeared in a variety of media outlets, including CBS News and CNN, and his blog, On the Brink, is one of the most popular sustainability blogs on the internet. His most recent book, Practical Sustainability, A Guide to a More Sustainable Life, published by Springer Nature, is out now. In this four-part series, which is provided with support from Springer Nature, Bob and I take a massive issue, sustainability, and break it down so we can examine it in a context that includes collective and individual responsibilities, research approaches, and how libraries can support sustainability research and goals. In this first episode, we discuss Bob's research background as a geologist, why urban centers tend to have better sustainability policies than suburban and rural regions, which to me was pretty surprising, and how course design and sustainability has changed over the years. All right, Bob, welcome to the program.
Well, thanks so much for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
All right, excellent. So you are a geologist by background, correct? How did you move into sustainability from there?
Well, the field of geology is one that is all about the earth. So I had a big love for the earth. So as a geologist, I spent a lot of time in the out of doors and enjoying nature. And my first big job was actually in diamond exploration. So it was my job to go out and to find diamonds, to find the location where people could locate them. And in order to do that, I had to go out and take these big samples of sediment in various parts of where I was doing my work. And the challenge was the company would send me out, they would look at maps and look at likely areas, and they would send me out into the field to find natural sediment. And that was the key. We had to find sediment that was unaltered by human activity. And almost every place they sent me, there was something. There was something that was wrong about the site. Either there was road gravel that had gotten into the site, or there was a lot of damage due to suburbanization or overland flow of runoff from farm fields, or something that made the locations where I was doing the work really unsuitable for what the purpose of what I was hired to do. And so I started to realize that almost every place on the planet was altered in some way by human activity, but we were just not recording it as geologists. And it got me interested in this whole idea that geologists were somehow getting the field of geology wrong, that geologists had to take a deeper look at the planet to better understand what we were seeing now as opposed to what we were learning in the textbooks. I mean, what we were learning in the textbooks, that was all great, but it was all about the world as unaltered by human activity. And what I was seeing out in the field was that our world was profoundly changed. And no one was talking about that in the field of geology back in the 80s when I was in school and when I was working in diamond exploration. People would have thought you were crazy or belonged outside of the field of geology. But indeed, as a geologist, I actually had trouble doing my job as a geologist because of the amount of alteration everywhere that I was working.
Yeah, that must have been interesting because having learned what you did and then having seen what you saw, that what you learned back then is basically all different, as you said, now because of that human alteration. And is it possible that 50 years, 100 years from now, that the practice might itself change to reflect what people in the future are looking back and seeing?
It's so funny, when I started in the field of geology, the idea of plate tectonics was relatively new. The
Mm,
idea that we all accept now that the plates are moving around the planet, that was a radical idea. And so if you went to the geology annual meetings, you might see a little bit around plate tectonics, but the research was relatively new. But and it was sort of true back then. If I went to when I went to the geology annual meetings, there would be a handful of papers that would be, at the end of the day in a room that nobody wanted to go at the conference about human alterations on the planet. And
hmm
now I was at the Geological Society of America's last meeting, and well over 50% of the presentations there and the papers that are given are now on human alteration of the earth in some way, whether it's through
Right.
climate change or sedimentary change or some other earth system change. It's a profound shift in the field of geology and earth science in just a generation.
Right. That's amazing. So you moved in eventually to the study of urban sustainability. I'm wondering if you can help trace your research interests into that topic. How did you land on that particular research focus?
Yeah, it was a weird one because I was working so much on how sediments move naturally on the planet. I was working with a gentleman whose name was Robert Eit, and he was an expert in soil chemistry. And I was working on a variety of things with soil chemistry related to mineralogy and natural earth systems. But he was focused very much in his research on early settlement analysis. And what he was looking at is that you could find early settlement analysis based on phosphorus traces in soil. So, like archaeologists would look for artifacts, he, as a soil chemist, was looking at human traces that are hundreds and hundreds of years old based on soil chemistry. So I was working with him and did a little bit of work with him on geoarchaeology. And as I started to look at what he was doing, I started to realize that, wait a second, this same methodology of mapping and tracing can be applied to anthropogenic chemicals in cities. And I started to look at soil chemistry in urban settings. And that's what
Mm,
started the whole movement of my interest in urban sustainability and urban geochemistry and how humans impact the planet through very subtle chemical changes on the surface of the earth.
hmm Excellent. So one of the takeaways I got from your book, Practical Sustainability, is how you talked about urban centers as actually sort of leaders in sustainability practices, when one might naturally think they're a little bit more problematic. And they tend to have a very advanced set of policies and infrastructure around sustainability. I'm curious if you could, just explain why that is, and then how do these characteristics relate to suburban and rural regions outside of those city centers?
Yeah, it's such an interesting difference. I always like to think of urban sustainability as super easy. Right. And I think it's
Yeah.
super easy because you have a strong central government, typically in the form of a mayor, and you have multiple departments. Like you might have a whole department of street sweeping, or a whole department of sewage treatment, a whole department of building codes and all of that. So you have experts in a variety of areas, often very highly trained in sustainability within their expertise, that lend those skills to moving a city's goals forward in the area of sustainability. So if I am, for example, the mayor of a city, I have a sustainability agenda, I can ask all of the department directors under me to move us forward in a certain percentage. Let's say I wanted to cut greenhouse gases 10% and increase our green energy by 20%. Well, those are measurable targets I can push down to all of the leaders in my community who run those departments, and they can marshal their teams to make that happen. And
hmm
so that's the reason that cities have been so successful. So if you look at New York City, for example, it had the leadership of Mayor Bloomberg, who was one of the strongest advocates for urban sustainability for many, many years. that city is often New York City is often considered one of the greenest cities in the world, even though if you're in New York City, you might not think of it as a green
Yeah.
city because you're surrounded by concrete and it's loud and it's dense and you might smell the garbage and the pollution. But on a per capita measurement basis, people who live in New York City tend to have a much smaller footprint, environmental footprint, than most other Americans. And that might be or not logical in many people's minds, but it's just the case of what happens when you live in a dense city. A
Hmm.
lot of people don't drive. They live in apartment buildings that often have advanced energy systems and all the rest. Suburbs are more complicated. I think that the suburbs and rural areas are places where we have a long way to go and a lot of really interesting work to move on in the next several decades and there are several reasons why the suburbs are somewhat problematic in this space. First of all, they often have weak central governments. It might be a a little town council or a suburban. You might have it in the suburbs. You might have a homeowners association, and often people move to the suburbs because it's cheaper to live. They don't want to pay for the expertise on the
Hmm.
staff to maybe move forward transportation initiatives or green energy initiatives. You also tend to draw people into the suburbs that are a little bit more independent minded and don't want to give up control of some of their decision making. So people may not want to move forward on, say, sewage treatment renovation because their taxes will go up and they'd rather just leave it as it is, even though it might not be the greenest thing for the community. So that's one thing. The other thing is because of the governments are small, there's often a lack of expertise in local governments. So you might where a city like New York can pull together some of the most amazing architects to work on green building. I mean, New York City has a LEED platinum skyscraper that's amazing. I mean, with
Hmm.
the most technological things in the world. And part of that was driven by people working in New York City government. Well, if you're in a small suburban community, you don't have that level of expertise in all those different kinds of departments. And so the suburbs tend to specialize in the kinds of sustainability things that they work on. So they might be a suburb that specializes on, say, food and community gardens or promoting small farms or backyard chickens or local honey or whatever it might be, but they might be terrible at other things like green energy or transportation. I mean, if you go to the villages, which some people might say is not that green of a community, I would argue that's the villages in Florida. It's a place that embraces the golf cart. There are less
Oh,
people
right.
on the road, and so you have people driving golf carts to grocery stores as opposed to big cars. So lots of places are doing small things, and the question is, what can we learn from all of these small places on how we can have greener suburbs overall? That it's more where it's more comprehensive.
Mm-hmm. I think we'll get into a lot more of that perspective as we talk about your book. But in the meantime, I'm curious, as you've designed courses over the years, say from the early 2000s onward, how have curricula changed during this time? I mean, you mentioned going to the conferences every year and, how folks are starting to study and look at things that are happening in the environment now. How is the actual teaching of these issues changing?
Yeah, for many years we broke down teaching of the environment into the large structural departments that you see at universities or
Hmm.
in schools. So you might learn about environmental science in a biology program or a geology or geography program or environmental policy and political science or in law. But there have been a number of interdisciplinary programs that have developed in the last 10 or 30, 40, 50 years that are based on environmental science and policy. And then in the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a growth in degree programs in sustainability itself, the field of
Hmm.
sustainability itself. So you can actually find universities where you can major or get a master's degree in sustainability. And this has been really transformative in many ways because the students now, young people are much more committed to to having their lives have more meaning than I think previous generations that, at least that I've taught. I remember when I first started teaching back in the 90s, this was in the days of the Wolf of Wall Street and all of that kind of stuff, where I wouldn't say all students, but many, many students were really all about trying to get the best job possible and make the most money that they could. And we still have students like that, certainly. But I would say that many more students recognize that the earth is in a crisis and that society has a number of challenges, and they want their lives to have greater meaning. And so they're choosing to major in things like sustainability or environmental science and policy, or one of the other transformative types of degrees where they're feeling like they're joining not they're not getting into a career. They're advancing their personal avocation for a particular topic, that they want their lives to have a deeper meaning in their college degree to match their personal ethics. So I think that's a big change. And of course, our curriculum has changed along with that. We're realizing that we have to have experiences for students that are more meaningful as well, that get them outside of the university into communities or into ways that they can find career paths for that type of work.
You just heard from Dr. Bob Brinkman, Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Northern Illinois University. He is also a professor of Earth, Atmosphere, and Environment, and an author, advocate, and researcher on issues of sustainability. His most recent book, Practical Sustainability, A Guide to a More Sustainable Life, published by Springer Nature, is out now. This 4-part series is brought to you with support from Springer Nature. Join us next week when Bob and I discuss his book and how he managed to take a global issue like sustainability and break it down into a tome of actionable advice and information for the general reader.
Right now, there are so many problems with the environment and so many sustainability issues, and people are seeing a real lack of global will, of national will, of a sense of the world coming together to try to solve the problems, that I wanted to give people tools that they could utilize, ways that they could make a measurable impact themselves, because people are frustrated that the governments around the world are not acting in their best interests in their mind on moving forward their sustainability ethic. And I wanted folks to have some actionable items, some measurable things that they could do to move forward.
As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.